Hello dear students, I am Sitaram, currently Vice Chancellor, Global University. I would like to discuss Chapter 6, Module 4, which deals with human rights and the post-human. You may be surprised to hear the term post-human because human rights are normally applied to the human being, not to the non-humans. What I, however, would like to do in this module is to look at the debates that have occurred on the human rights question of the non-human beings. That includes animals, the wider planetary environment, and more recently the post-human. Without looking at the comprehensive nature of this debate, only post-human would not be able to help us in understanding the problem that human rights faces today in the wake of the post-human. I also would like to locate this particular module in the context of the chapter. We began in Module 1 with an overview of the new challenges law and technology have begun to face in the last few decades in the wake of new technologies, that is information and communication technologies, biotechnologies, or other forms of technologies that led to a variety of impacts on the human life, whether it is workplace, whether it is understanding of the human self itself, or whether it is questions of privacy, or whether it is question of surveillance and security, and so on. So the key themes that we covered so far are the question of surveillance and the state question in contemporary times, the newer kind of strategies that the nation states are adapting to deal with the questions of surveillance, which is causing a variety of concerns in terms of the security of the person, right to liberty, and so on and so forth. And in a similar way, we have also seen the impact of media and communication technologies on the specific issue of privacy and how the idea has transformed from a very 19th century concept of being a very private matter of the individual into the privacy question in the wider world of social media and beyond. Now, in this module, I would like to sum up with certain speculative themes, because while surveillance and privacy kind of questions are very much here and now in contemporary times, we also repeatedly face issues that may not necessarily be very much relevant in contemporary time, but are very much going to be the important themes of understanding how a particular discourse is likely to change, or what kind of challenges a legal framework is going to face. That's what I am going to do in this module. In order to understand the post-human, first of all, we need to understand the basic approaches to human rights. Once I clarify my basic approaches description, I will then move on to the post-human. Let's begin with the basic approaches to human rights question. Broadly, there are two approaches that everyone refers to. The first one is what is known as anthropocentric or human-centric approach to human rights. In other words, this particular approach perceives the human being as the center of the universe. So in other words, the universe exists because the human being needs to survive. The second, the ultimate goal of humankind is self-preservation by mastering the universe. So in other words, the purpose of the human existence is to master the universe. In other words, get control over nature, control over animals, control over the surroundings. And that's the other belief in this particular philosophy. And third, everything exists in the universe for the benefit of the human being. In other words, it is all for the human being to benefit from reaping the nature's bounty. So whether it is once again animal planet, whether it is the environment at the wider level, all that is for the human consumption. And this particular approach is the conventional, or it is the Enlightenment approach to human rights, which sees the human-centered nature. It is under criticism by those who believe the other approach, because this particular thing brings a kind of instrumentalism to the human being's justification of every approach to control, dominate, and even destroy the surroundings and the human environment at large. The second approach, the ecocentric approach, is the opposite, which perceives the universe as a complex and inexplicable arrangement of interconnected beings. In other words, human being is no longer the center of the universe. The universe is a conglomerate of various kinds of species, and the species survival is complexly connected, but those connections are sometimes discernible, sometimes not, and therefore there is no finality of an answer as to what leads to whose survival. And that particular kind of a complex organism as the basis of the ecosphere in which we are, and therefore the inevitable nature of interconnectedness, is what the primary point of ecocentric approach is. It also perceives human being as one among a myriad organisms that form the ecosphere of life. In other words, the life forms are so diverse and so inexplicably complex that human being is merely one among them, and that's an understanding that human beings must get if they want to understand the ecocentric approach. And finally, that this approach also believes that there is a close and delicate connection between the sustaining the ecosphere and species survival. In other words, the survival of human being and therefore the survival of the species at large depends on sustaining the ecosphere, and which means sustaining the balance of the ecosphere. So which would naturally lead to a problem where the human being doesn't know the interconnectedness and its complexities fully yet, at least, and then the survival of the human species therefore is not an end in itself. It has to mediate itself vis-a-vis the survival of many other species, and that's what the very complexity of interconnectedness is. And this is the ecocentric approach as a contrast. Now let's see what is the way these two debates apply to the basic question that I posed in the beginning, that is, should human rights be applicable to non-humans? So in other words, are human rights only for human beings, or should there be a broader understanding of human rights as a language of species rights? Not just human species, but species of the ecosphere. And that particular contrast could be seen through, for instance, two major debates that happened outside the human rights framework. Number one is the debate on the human rights of animals. In other words, what is the basis of thinking about rights of the animals? Should they have rights? They can't speak. They can't understand what is the world around in the way human beings do. They don't have a culture quite like human beings who have a sense of creating a language, a particular way of communication, and so on. This is a general sense by which human beings looked at animals, until more recently far more serious scholarly work demonstrated that all species do have various ways of communication which may not be discernible to a naked human eye, but they do have, and there is a complex way by which these organisms have survival mechanisms, communication strategies, and so on and so forth. But will that be enough to say that animals should have rights? And if it is so, what is the basis? One long-standing movement in human societies across the world, especially in the developed West, where the treatment of animals was really at its abysmal low in late 19th and early 20th centuries, the cruelty to animals became an issue. So the plank of argument for the animal rights activists in the initial stages was cruelty to animals must be abandoned. In other words, there must be a humane practice, whether it is slaughter, whether it is other forms of whether it is slaughter or whether other forms of dealing with the human dealing of the animals, that needs to be humanized. It is a humanistic virtue where the animals are to be treated with humane approach and seen to it that the violence meted to them is minimal in terms of the practices like slaughter. But that is once again very much within the fold of a humanistic virtue where the human beings feel pained about the cruelty meted to the animals, and therefore that should not be there. But that still is not a rights approach. So what is the basis by which animals can have rights? That obviously led to a larger philosophical exploration. Should non-human beings have rights in the way human beings do, and if it is so, should it be based upon dignity or should it be based upon other kinds of virtues that we need to explore? Or if it is dignity, what does dignity mean? Is avoiding cruelty is the only question with regard to animals? What should be the approach? And I think those are really not an easily answerable questions, but it's a large debate, the animal rights debate, and we keep on coming in terms of course, humanizing and mitigating cruelty is a dominant thing that we see as part and parcel of this debate that continues even today. But that is not an adequate foundation to think about rights, and therefore we have to answer as to why animals should have rights and what does that mean to human beings to understand. The second debate I would like to flag off, and I will conclude subsequently as to the key points that emerge from both, is what are environmental rights? Why is it that we need a right to clean environment, clean water, access to sustainable eco resources? What is environmental right? Often the debate once again of environmental rights in earlier context was influenced deeply by this human need to survival and what should environment mean to that. Of course, it's an integral part. There is no denial that ecological resources are very critical for human survival. That goes without saying. But if you extend the same logic to a much wider phenomenon, then obviously industrial harvestings, large tree fellings in tropical forests, all of them would also become part of human survival questions. Of course, a little arguable point that it is being done indiscriminately and so on. So therefore, the caution is the only point that will come rather than philosophically changing the argument whether environment, the right to environment is seen only as something that is to be serving the needs of the human being. I think that obviously is an issue to understand. Now let me turn to the point of the contrasting of these two approaches, the ecocentric approach versus the anthropocentric approach. The key point obviously can be discerned through the debates on environmentalism. The international lawyer Catherine Ridgwell some time ago provided a broader framework in which she argued that there is a contrast between the way right to environment is to be seen vis-a-vis the rights of the environment. And I think the contrast between right to environment and rights of environment sums up the philosophical differences between the ecocentric approach and the anthropocentric approach. The anthropocentric approach perceives the right as right to environment, and predominantly that means it is human beings need to have clean and safe access to environmental resources. Whereas in the context of ecocentric approach, it is rights of the environment. And what does it mean? It means to perceive that all the planetary species, that is the animal planetary world, the forests, the trees, everyone who is identified as a species of the life world has rights. And how should we therefore find a mechanism of honoring those rights, or whether human beings must acquire a different kind of a language of rights whereby they would see their own responsibility towards the rights of, say, animals, towards the rights of, say, the trees, and so on and so forth. It might sound a little speculative and very seriously unacceptable for those who would take anthropocentric approach very seriously. But it is important if we are to believe the complexity of the interlinkages that I pointed out in the beginning. If we don't pay adequate attention to those philosophical questions, we are quite likely that we are going to face serious issues with regard to the very idea of the human very soon, and that we will see when I am going to touch upon the post-human. Now let me come to the point of the post-human. What is the key point? I will prelude the post-human discussion with the following. Let us assume what is the key point by which the human rights debate happens: dignity. And dignity is necessarily connected to the idea of emotion, feeling. And then it is equally connected to a rational part of the self, agency, capacity to act. In other words, human rights therefore is very clearly connected to a thinking being, a rational being who has a capacity to act and feel through the emotion. And so if these are qualities that we have to delineate from the human rights debate and try and say, what if all planetary species have emotions? What if all planetary species have a sense of a rationale? In other words, they have a particular way by which they also have a capacity to act. That we may not be able to see, but they do. Then of course it is then the critical question as to how do we frame the languages of responsibilities of the human beings vis-a-vis those species. It becomes more complicated when we are to ask a question: what if the human beings have to face machines who have acquired emotions? It might sound tremendously science fiction question, and it is of course science fiction question at this point of time, but it is no longer an isolated science fiction question. We know the great work of Stanley Kubrick, the Hollywood director, and his Space Odyssey film way back 50 years ago, where he tried to show what would happen if machines were to acquire emotions. And it's an interesting speculation at that time, but last 10 years we have seen, both in Hollywood as well as across the film field in many regional languages and in Hindi language in India, a number of films on the robo and the humanoid robo, a robo who has acquired emotion, fears, jealousy and other kind of human failings, quite like any other natural human being. And then what happens? And of course we have a number of dystopian, maybe somewhat funny, sometimes energizing human stories. But that's not what I'm interested to really delve into. But the fact that there is a possibility of thinking that machines can have emotions or can acquire emotions is an interesting problem that we need to understand. So let me broadly then come to the question of what is post-human. There are three ways of looking at the problem of the post-human. The post in social theory always is an ambiguous term. It at sometimes declares the end of something, it sometimes declares as opposition to something, or it sometimes declares as an extension to something or an expansion of something. And I would suggest that in the case of post-human as well, the meaning exists in all the three forms. So the post-human in one sense could be seen as anti-human, that is destroying the possibility of human agency and threatening the preeminence of the human in the planet. And I think that is a possibility that leads to a variety of fear psychosis. The films that I mentioned in my earlier discussion are all by and large deal with this whole problem of the machines taking over the human planet and marginalizing the human self. And it's an interesting point to think about how that fear psychosis operates in creating a kind of a dystopian or a negative view of this anti-human position of the post-human. Now, that's a very predominant view. That's a view that exists in a widespread both in philosophical discussions as well as in the popular representations that we see in films and so on. The second representation is post-human as the arrival of machines capable of emotions. So in other words, there is some significant kinds of neurotransformations that seem to be happening whereby the machine, which naturally doesn't have except mechanical memory, is acquiring some kind of an automated sense of the self, and through that it is becoming a kind of emotional being. It is acquiring sense of moral sense of right or wrong, or feeling jealousy, or feeling emotional about things that like human beings do. And that is the second thing whereby we probably see an expanded sense of the human self. In other words, there is a possibility of viewing human beings coexisting with machines as co-equals, and that is what the emotion determines in machines. The third way of looking at post-human is post-human as the transformation of the human body into cybernetic organism that is both simple and complex. What I mean is, well, conventionally those who use the term cyborgs or cybernetic organisms in post-Second World War social theory used it in order to denote any kind of extension of the human body through a mechanical device is seen as a cyborg. But today's cyborgs are far more complex imaginations, which is half human, half machine imagination of the cyborg is very much there. It could be added to further in terms of the other forms of biotechnological devices that are being thought through, speculated through, and written about. Let's quickly see the summary of the post-human debate before we go into the rights implication. Let's take the fear question. The approach that post-human is actually the end of the human, as I was trying to say, has broadly the following points. It is ending or clearly spelling out the end of human dominance on the planet. So that's one clear anxiety part for those who take fear as the approach to look at this rise of the machines. the end of coherent rational human being. So in other words, one of the key pointers of the Enlightenment debates on the assumption of the human being as a rights bearing self is we are a very coherent rational being. In other words, we think rationally, we act rationally, we mediate and moderate our desires in the light of reason. Thomas Hobbes very famously tried to say that these two, the feeling of desire and feeling of reason, are the two sides of the inner self of the human being, and reason is the one that moderates and transforms the desire question. And that makes human being a very coherent human being, a rational self. And that particular way of looking at the human self is coming to an end because of the arrival of the post-human. The third is the rise of the super-intelligent machines. The super-intelligent machines who probably even could have a humanoid form, whereby the very idea of the human is being challenged. So in other words, you see someone very human in terms of appearance and also being capable of certain kinds of emotions, which could make human beings quite startled, to say the least. There are also others who believe this possibility of the post-human, whatever it is indicating, both philosophically as well as speculatively, as something what we should see as a real exciting opportunity of looking at how the planetary transformation is taking place. I will present broadly two key themes that are being debated on the side of not being very negative about this post-human issue. The first one is to perceive the ecosphere as a dynamic, reflexive conglomerate of multiple actors, and the super intelligent machines as mere new addition to the complexity. In other words, the human beings already do not know a lot of life on earth and the complexity of their interconnectedness. The arrival of the new machines is merely another addition of a kind of new organism, and that obviously is a far more positive approach than feeling threatened by the arrival of the super intelligent machines. The second thing is post-human as an inevitable direction of newer opportunities to explore the expansion of human life on the planet. In other words, human planet always had various forms of species and they are continuously expanding, and the post-human merely is a new addition. And in both ways, the excitement is not so much about the arrival of a new species, but see what kind of challenges it poses to make our planet more livable and more meaningful. I will now come to the point of the old norms and the new questions. In other words, human rights are the old norms, the Enlightenment idea, and new questions are the arrival of the new life form called the post-human, and what does human rights mean to the new situation. I would certainly say philosophically the following two are important points to take note of. There is a need to redefine the emotion, the agency question, and the rights bearing self question. So in other words, in an anthropocentric world, the question of emotion, agency, and rights bearing self are necessarily only human being and no one else. Whereas if we are taking a wider approach to it, then emotion, agency, and rights bearing self can be extended to animal planet, can be extended to wider world of environment, can be now extended to the very idea of the post-human itself. What implications would it have is an interesting point, and we have already seen societies, associations, clubs that try and argue and articulate, say, rights of the robos and so on. So in other words, we have a direction of work which is indicating that human beings must learn to become more responsible towards dealing with anything that probably has a kind of life. Right? That obviously is one thing that is happening, and it's an interesting direction to see what are the kinds of possibilities open up. The second most important point I would say philosophically to take note is human rights not to be seen merely as a language of entitlements of the human beings, but to see human rights as a language of human responsibility in an unpredictable unfolding of planetary life. In other words, if we imagine planet as something that would have unpredictable unfolding of life, and it has been all through and through, and if it is so, then human rights must make human beings responsible towards those situations. In other words, it's not merely a language of seeking entitlements vis-a-vis the state or society or other individuals, but also acquiring greater obligations and responsibilities towards the other species, and that includes the species of the post-human. And therefore, this whole conflict of the fear versus excitement could be summed up with this quote I would like to recite from Catherine Hales, who has written this wonderful book, How We Became Post-Human, concludes the book with this particular sentence. Let me read it out for our discussion. Although some current versions of the post-human point toward the anti-human and the apocalyptic, we can craft others that would be conducive to the long-range survival of the humans and of the other life forms, biological and artificial, with whom we share the planet and ourselves. And I believe that sums up the philosophy in which we will have to rethink human rights not merely as entitlements, but human rights as a powerful language that will make human beings responsible towards the rest of the species. Thank you.